So I want to talk a little bit today about setting goals or wishing for better things in our life. And I also want to talk about nurturing the real self. To do that, I want to talk about something that's common in Disney musicals. A lot of times you'll see the main character of a Disney musical and also of other musicals and even in other movies expressing their desires for a better life or for the wishes of their heart early in the film. In this case, we have Snow White, who is singing, "I'm wishing for the one I love to find me today." Funnily enough, he happens to walk up just then. But this concept is called the "I Wish" song, and it's prevalent in a lot of musicals. All Disney animated musicals, their main character sings the "I Wish" song right near the beginning of the film. In Beauty and the Beast, we have Belle singing about her desires. Let me pull this video up here.
Is he gone? Can you imagine? He asked me to marry me, the wife of that boorish, brainless Madame Gaston. Can't you just see it? Madame Gaston, his little wife. No, sir, not me. I guarantee it. I want much more than this provincial life. I want adventure in the great wide somewhere. I want it more than I can tell. And for once it might be grand to have someone understand. I want so much more than they've got planned.
Excellent. So that's Belle's wish, that she wants adventure in the great wide somewhere. And for just once, she wants someone to understand that she wants so much more than they've got planned, right? And these are always wishes that we tend to be able to relate to, that they're extremely relatable. In The Little Mermaid, I want to be where the people are. She wants legs. In Aladdin, they'd find out there's so much more to me. He just wants to be seen for who he is instead of being seen as a street rat. In The Lion King, I just can't wait to be king. In Frozen, it doesn't have to be a snowman. This is little Anna, and she just wants to play with her sister. She wants to have some kind of productive interaction. She doesn't care what it is. Do you want to build a snowman? But, it doesn't even have to be a snowman. I just want to spend time with you. Villains also get their "I Wish" songs a lot of times. This is Scar's wish. "I'll be king undisputed, respected, saluted, and seen for the wonder I am." This is Gaston. "I'm going to make Belle my wife." And a lot of the dreams are really grand, in the grandest sense. Hercules sings, "I have often dreamed of a far-off place where a great warm welcome will be waiting for me, and the crowds will cheer when they see my face. And they'll know that that's where I'm meant to be," right? And we can relate to that. We all have had that kind of feeling of hope for a better world. They also can be widely relatable, just in their nature. Here's Tevye, and he sings, "If I were a rich man, yabba dibba 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 da dum." And we can relate to that too. Just as we can relate to the grand dreams, we can also relate to the more practical ones. It's not just Disney, as you can tell, that has this formula. The main characters of all the major musicals sing a "I Wish" song. Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music sings, "My heart wants to beat like the wings of the birds that rise from the lake to the trees." In Wicked, these two characters sing, "There's no fight we cannot win." In some movies, the entire cast gets to join in and sing their "I Wish" song. And that's the case in Tangled, all these different characters singing all their various "I wishes" all at the same time. And in 1997, Stephen Sondheim has a song right at the start of the musical Into the Woods where 7 different characters sing their "I Wish" songs all at the same time. I wish, I wish, I wish, I wish, all on top of each other as a septet. And it's a really intense way to have exposure to all these different characters all at once and get to know them all at the same time right in the opening number. Now, the wish songs are important because they introduce us to the character in a very special way. They give us insight into their motivations, and also they move the characters to action. They help us understand what the character's after and why they would take certain actions in order to achieve the dreams that they've expressed earlier in the film. And so it's really critical to establish that early in these films. Now, for a moment here, before we move on, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to take out a sheet of paper and spend about 3 minutes writing down some of the wishes that you have in your life. They can be big and dreamy. They can be a little more practical. They can be about your relationships. Whatever your wishes are, you just take a minute, pause the film here, and just write some of those out. And then when you're done, go ahead and start this back up. Okay, so hopefully you have your little list of wishes now. And what I want to do is shift and talk about another principle that I think is super important to understand. In the animal kingdom, we tend to acknowledge certain animals for unique characteristics. So in this example, we know tigers have stripes, right? And you can see the tiger hiding here in the bushes. In another example, you might say an elephant has a trunk, or a giraffe has a long neck, or zebras have stripes, or whatever the characteristic that makes them stand out in the animal kingdom. Here, leopards have spots. See if you can figure out where that leopard is. He's right down here in the bushes by this tree. And humans, our special feature is that we have a relatively large cerebral cortex, and that's this green area of the brain. The red part of the brain is the reptilian brain. It's a part of the brain that most reptiles and birds and mammals have. It controls things like breathing and this kind of stuff. It keeps us alive. Then the yellow part is what's known as the limbic system, or you could also say it's kind of like this midbrain, and it involves some emotions and some different higher order functions, higher than the red part, but not as complex as what goes on in this green part, which is called the cerebral cortex, and that's where the most complex forms of thinking happen. And when you measure the mass of the cerebral cortex and then you compare it to the body mass of the organism, humans have the largest cerebral cortex relative to their body mass. It's just absolutely massive. Elephants have a larger cerebral cortex in terms of total weight, but when you compare it to the mass of their body, it's smaller than ours in terms of relative to their body mass. Same with, you can go and look at a blue whale or a dolphin or whatever. And they have large brains, and even the blue whale, the weight of it is pretty heavy. But compared to their body size, it's smaller than ours. And so that's important to understand. The thing about humans that's the unique thing about us is that we have this massive brain and we can think thoughts like no other organism can. Now, here's some other ways to think about that. Like, here's our brain, and it has different parts of it. Here in our brain is the parietal lobe. This is our sensory cortex, where we kind of take information in. A cat has that same part of the brain, and so does a rat. But you can see ours is far more complex than that of a cat's, and that's more complex than a rat's. The same is the temporal lobe here, which is where we store memories and things. The cats have a temporal lobe just like us, where they store memories, but it's just not nearly as developed as ours. Same with a rat. Finally, we have an occipital lobe, where we process visual imagery here at the back of our head. Cats have that too, and so do rats, but neither of theirs are nearly as complex as ours. Now, an important thing to understand is that our cerebral advantages would be rendered ineffectual or absolutely useless if it weren't for another unique characteristic about humans. And I usually have students guess about this, and answers that they give, they say, oh, we have opposable thumbs, and no, that's not right. Or they say, oh, I know what it is. It's our ability to, I don't know. They come up with different things, and usually in a good sized group of about 30 kids, one kid will finally say the correct answer, which is, we have each other. We have social groups. And that's absolutely right. Mammals have the most complex social groups, except maybe for one exception, which would be ants. Their social orders are pretty complex. But we rely on each other for survival, mammals in general, and especially humans, in very interesting ways. Here's two otters holding hands as they sleep. Otters hold hands as they sleep so that they don't drift away from each other in the middle of the night, and they can stay together. Elephants, they assign the oldest female to be the matriarch of the herd because she has the longest memory. And so when there's a drought or when there's calamity in the land, she has the best memory of where to go to survive, where to get help, where to get water, where's a place of safety. And so they assign her to do that and rely on her memory because it's the longest memory. Penguins do something super funny. Around the habitat of penguins, leopard seals hang out. And here's a leopard seal about to bite the face off of this little penguin. What penguins will do is they all bunch near the edge of an iceberg. And they keep bunching closer and closer, all together, closer and closer, until it's quite crowded. And they wait for one penguin to fall in. And then they all look. See these penguins craning their necks? They're all looking. And what they're looking to see is whether or not Jeff gets eaten. Because it's a test to see, is there a leopard seal in this area? Because if there is, this is going to happen almost immediately. And of course, then they won't go in the water. They'll just hang out for a little while longer until that leopard seal goes away, or they'll maybe go and find a different ledge to jump off of. But in this way, penguins rely on each other. It's kind of this weird, like, oh, let's see who falls in first. Whoops, there goes Phil. Oh, good luck, Phil. Well, let's hope that there's not a leopard seal there. But the social grouping really helps them to be far more adaptive than if they had to survive on their own. And we're that same way. Humans are the most reliant on other members of their species, of any other organism. We have the longest period of juvenile dependency, and that correlates with the mass of our cerebral cortex. When you have so much cerebral cortex, it takes a long time to fill it with survival strategies. And the way you learn survival strategies, and let me just be clear about this, the red and the yellow part of the brain in this diagram, way up here, these are the instinctive parts of the brain. They control our instincts. And instincts can help you survive really well if you got claws and sharp teeth. They can help instincts really drive you well if you want to eat raw meat for dinner every night. But if you're a human, the thing that's really going to help you survive is not so much your instincts, but really this green part of the brain, your thought, your ability to think complex thoughts and do some planning. And so we have this really heavy mass of cerebral cortex matter that needs to be filled up with survival strategies, not with instincts. And we need each other in order to do that. We need parents and siblings and friends to help us figure out how are we going to make sense of this world and survive in it. We have the longest period of juvenile dependency. Depending on how you want to argue it, it's anywhere from 12 to 18 years. And the next longest period of juvenile dependency in the animal kingdom is the elephant. They are dependent on their parents for 2 years. And so the fact that we're dependent on our parents for survival and well-being up to 14, 15, 16, 18 years really says that we're head and shoulders above in not only the amount of brain space that we have to fill up with survival strategies, but also the importance that social interactions play in our lives and our ability to function one with another. Now, another way to look at this would be what sociobiologists call selection. Now, this is not a system that's used terribly much anymore. It's been replaced by a system called life history, but it is helpful to kind of look at it in terms of just a light kind of discussion of animal kingdom. Our selected animals are basically animals that survive by producing en masse. They don't necessarily expect every single member of their group to survive. What they do is they just have 80,000 babies and then just play the odds. They tend to live, our selected species tend to live in environments that are highly unstable. So sandbars and mud puddles and river deltas that change a lot. And because their environments change so much, they can't count on everyone surviving. And so evolution has selected them just to make a massive amount of children and hope that the odds carry them through. On the other hand, K-selected species, they tend to have a larger body mass and they tend to live in more stable environments, like a forest as opposed to a beach. And by living in a more stable environment, they're able to live quite a bit longer, and they have more time to take the survival skills that have been learned by the parent and transfer them to the child. And that's a period of juvenile dependency. Crabs and spiders and fruit flies have absolutely no juvenile dependent period at all. The babies of spiders don't rely on their parents at all. And this is why you can have fish laying eggs on a leaf and then leaving, right? Because they don't need to raise those fish. The fish are going to survive entirely by their instincts. They're not going to think thoughts in the way that we do with their cerebral cortex, that green, the outer part of the brain. Instead, they're going to use their instincts to survive, and that's super successful when you got 800,000 other brothers and sisters that are also doing that. Your species is going to do quite nicely. But when you have that cerebral cortex that needs to be filled with their thoughts and survival strategies and skills that are actually require reason, you really want a bond with a more knowledgeable peer or parent that can really guide you through that. And there's a funny clip I just want to show real quick here. It comes from Charlotte's Web. At the end of Charlotte's Web, there's the pig Wilbur, and his friend Charlotte the spider dies. But before she dies, she lays some eggs, and at the end of the book, at the end of the film, they hatch. And so here they are hatching out of their egg. And this is, spiders are selected. They survive just by sheer numbers. Vast majority of a spider's children will die, but even if one lives, that's enough, right? And so that's what's about to happen here. And Wilbur's going to experience this for the first time. Wilbur's a pig. He's a K-selected species. He feels like children should be reliant on their parents. And so he's expecting to have to raise all these babies. But watch what happens.
Hello there. Hello. I'm an old friend of your mother's. Are you all right? Is everything all right?
We're just fine. I'm glad you're out here.
What are you doing up there?
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Wait a minute. Where do you think you're going?
Goodbye. We're going out into the world to make webs for ourselves.
Are all of you going? You can't all go. Children!
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Okay, so that tear that just fell out of Wilbur's eye, that's a K-selected tear. He's reacting very strongly to this whole R-selected situation where the babies don't need any help. And that's just really terrible for him because he thought they were going to be a little bit more like a pig and stick around and say, oh, please help us. We need your help to fill up our brains. But, of course, spiders don't have complex brains. They just survive off of instincts. Okay, so that's a kind of a funny interaction with this K-selected tear that Wilbur sheds. And it helps us to see the difference between these types of species. Now, the reason why that's important is because if you're a K-selected species, then you participate in societies. And the fundamental unit of any society is a dyad. And a dyad's just two people, one to the other. And a dyad that involves frequent, affectively pleasant interaction, or that's another way of saying emotionally pleasant interaction, combined with consistent, stable caring. And so you can think about this in terms of, like, you may have had a best friend at some point who moved a long distance away, 8 states away or something. And you may still care about them, but being so far away really affects your ability to have frequent, emotionally pleasant interactions that are consistent and stable because of that distance. And that's kind of what this idea of a dyad is we have to understand that in societies, it's those one-to-one interactions like this gorilla and the child that really begin to matter and that make our lives full and rich. And we want them to be emotionally pleasant. We want them to be frequent. We want them to be consistent, and so we can rely on them. And we also want them to be stable. And so this is kind of like what a dyad looks like. In our earliest, let's look at this. And a dyad is constituted, usually when I teach this, I have a student come up, and I'll have 2 little tokens. They might be 2 marbles or 2 little puff balls. And what I'll do is I'll start with both of them in my hand, and I'll say to the student, as I take this marble here in my right hand, I'm going to pass it to your left hand. And then what I want you to do is pass it from your left hand to your right hand, and then I want you to hand it back to me into my left hand. And we'll kind of create this circle here so that as I hand you something into your left hand, you're handing me something into my left hand. And then we'll change that to our right hand, and then we'll do it again. And you can imagine that as you do that, you begin to develop this rhythm of exchange where the one person is passing off something and then the other person's passing something back. And that rhythm is really what a dyad is all about. It's this idea of exchanging things. Marbles represent any number of exchanges or units of exchange. They could be saying, hey, I'm really tired right now, and the other person hands back, oh, do you need anything from me? Or it could be a, I love you, another person hands back, I love you too. Or it can be a, hey, I'm pretty frustrated with you right now, and the other person hands back and says, oh, really? Tell me about that so that we can understand it. And then the next exchange is, well, this happened. And then the other person says, oh man, I do remember that happening. I experienced it a little differently. Do you mind if I tell you about that? And the other person says, sure, go ahead. And then this kind of rhythm happens. Now, usually what I'll do is I'll get a student prepared, and I'll before class, I'll say, hey, I'm going to have you volunteer and come up and do this kind of exchange with these marbles with me. And then about halfway through, I'm going to smack your hand, and I'm going to knock the marble out of your hand. And so the class will be startled by that, but you don't need to be, I'm not trying to hurt you, and I'll try to do it gently, but I do want you to let that marble fall out of your hand and even look surprised, and the class will be all startled by this, right? And so I'll do that. We'll be doing this rhythm, and then once it's down, I'll smack their hand, and the marble will go flying, and everyone will gasp, oh! And it's very startling. And then I turn and I say, okay, now wait a minute. I just want you to know that I whoever this student is, I told them that I was going to do that ahead of time. But what was so startling about that? And of course, the obvious thing is that here we had this nice rhythm of exchange of back and forth between each other, and when I slap the hand, that really it upsets the balance of this interaction. And so then I collect the marble and I say, okay, now student, we're going to start this up again. And they kind of usually will back off just a tad, right? They're nervous about it, and I say, okay, now wait, what just happened? And they go, oh, I don't trust that you're not going to do that again. And they go, right. When I, instead of having an emotionally positive exchange with you, instead of having a stable, consistent exchange where there's this rhythm of exchange between the two partners, instead of having this rhythm of exchange, whoops, I went too far with the slides here. Instead of having this rhythm of exchange, I broke with consistency and really hurt you in a way that's going to cause you not to trust me, and that's a problem. And we need to talk about that. So in order to talk about that, I need to draw a diagram. So I'm going to pull up this paint program here. And I just want to show you how this kind of begins to happen as we're children. As we're growing up, we have in our minds a deep reliance on our parents, particularly on our mothers. And this reliance is so strong that the mother becomes what psychologists call a primary object or a secure base. And that secure base allows us to get the nurturing that we need and the love that we need so that we can be successful in the world. As we grow, the children want to explore away from the secure base, and they will. And the thing is about exploring is that as we explore, our mother or the caregiver, our primary caregiver, that's another name for this, primary caregiver, can encourage us to explore or really make us afraid of exploring by the messages they give us about what's out in the world. They might say, hey, you can go explore, but you need to know that the world is a scary place. It's full of monsters, and you need to be worried about it, right? Or they can encourage us to explore and say, hey, go out there, and as often as you encounter what's called impasse. Impasse is when things don't go well. We're walking around our living room and a lamp falls on our head, or we're going about our business and another kid steals a toy from us. As often as you encounter impasse, then you go ahead and you just come right on back, and we'll sort that out, and then we'll send you back out into the world again until you encounter impasse again. And then when you encounter impasse, then you can come back. Now usually what happens and this is super important to understand, is that when kids encounter impasse, they do two things. They signal and they return. And both of those are important because the way that the parent or the primary caregiver responds to that signaling really sets a pattern. Not only, so there's another interaction here that's important. So the parent can encourage the exploration or kind of try to avoid it, or maybe encourage too much exploration, telling a toddler, hey, you should go and play in the street. That's a great idea. That's too much exploration early. And really you can encounter some levels of impasse way out here that are inappropriate for your level of development. But anyway, there's this encouragement of exploration, and then when the child encounters impasse as is inevitable, then the child signals through crying and then returns, and the parent, how they receive that. Some parents say, oh, hey, quit crying, you're a big kid, like stop that or whatever. Or some parents overdo it. They're like, oh, little baby, you've been hurt and you're a victim, and oh, the world, see, I told you the world was full of monsters that are big and scary. You should, this kind of thing. And so the way that the parent both encourages exploration and responds to a child's signaling return after impasse is really critical and sets the pattern for later relationships in their life. As children grow, their ability to explore expands, and they're less able, or excuse me, they have less desire to return to the parent immediately all the time, right? So this is like your kid goes to school and gets bullied, but you don't find out about it because the kid says, well, maybe I can deal with this myself. I don't have to tell my parents or whatever. And eventually, the desire to return to the secure base really diminishes, and you're out here, and what you can have happen with a really healthy adult is basically the adult encounters impasse and then is able to, because of the care that they receive from their parent, is able to self-soothe. And because they can self-soothe, then there's no need to return to the primary caregiver, right? Because they can just repeat, right? And then maybe, every Christmas, okay, well, we're going to go and visit, the primary caregiver and just catch up or whatever. But then we're going to come back out into the world and continue this cycle of, well, that doesn't say self at all. It says cephal. Anyway, you get the idea. Self-soothe. And you could do this little cycle out here. Now, these early interactions with the primary caregiver, the secure base, set up our whole pattern for how we're going to deal with relationships in our later life. So that if we experienced a lot of hand slapping, so to speak, with that example with the marble exchange, where we were getting punished a lot for wanting to have a positive dyad, then we're going to grow up and maybe we'll have trust issues, or maybe we're going to have issues with maybe we're bullying other people, or any number of things. And that gets to be a problem, doesn't it? Our dyadic interactions become problematic, and it's because of the patterns that we experienced in that secure-based relationship primarily, but also in other relationships. Our interactive patterns can be influenced by relationships with siblings. Sometimes I'll have students talking to me, and I'll suddenly realize just from intuition, oh, this student had a really abusive older sibling that picked on him all the time. And I'll say, did you have an older brother that picked on you all the time? And they go, oh, yeah. And I go, yeah, you sound like you really don't trust people not to hurt you. You really are going around expecting people to just wipe you out all the time. And oh, yeah, that's true. Or any number of things. Also, the people that we date can have a big effect on us. We pattern our interpersonal relationships and romantic relationships after the relationships that we have with our siblings and also with our parents. And so if we get really hurt or abused in an interpersonally romantic relationship, then we can have the same kind of destructive patterns start to emerge in our behaviors of exchange around units of interpersonal kind of dyadic interaction. Okay? Now, enter the scene James F. Masterson. He's a really great author, and he wrote this book called The Search for the Real Self. And his main argument is that as we go through interactions with other people that aren't satisfactory or that are abusive or that are somehow that really don't nurture us in the way that we need to be nurtured, we really begin to lose a handle on our real self, and we begin to create a fake or a false or a counterfeit self. And so in order to understand this, and he writes the book is called The Search for the Real Self, right? We're trying to find it again. It's been lost. But in order to understand this, I want to use the metaphor of this ball here. This is a nice round ball. This represents the real self. There's some things I want you to notice about it. It's pure. There's a certain purity to this ball. It's clean. It's pretty. It's this nice little round white ball, and it's been formed, and it's not perfect. You see some, if you look closely in this picture, you can see some tiny imperfections there, but nonetheless, it's quite nice. And there's some main characteristics of the real self that this ball is going to help us to understand. First of all, the real self is genuine. You'll notice that there's nothing masking what's going on here with this ball. It's exposed, and in being exposed, it's really reflecting an authenticity about itself, or a genuineness. And in our lives, the real self is genuine. It expresses itself genuinely. So if it's angry, it's going to express that as genuinely as possible. Not necessarily, blown out of proportion, like yelling and screaming and red face and stuff like this, but like just being genuine and saying, I'm hurt. Really, right? That's really the emotion. Anger is a lot of times just hurt, right? Or it's happiness, not trying to hide when we're delighted, or not trying to hide when we are excited, or whatever it is. Okay, so the real self is genuine. The real self is also sensitive. Notice that this ball, its surface is exposed, and in being exposed, it's kind of this raw situation where it's if a breeze went past this ball, it'd feel it. It'd whip past. It's almost like that skin underneath your forearm, that's super sensitive. And just if you run your finger on, you can feel it because it's just so sensitive. And that's the real self. The real self is also very sensitive. It's aware of its surroundings, and it's very interested in what's going on, especially with other people. And so the funny thing is about being genuine and sensitive is, if you're being genuine and you're being sensitive, you're probably being fairly responsible at the same time. And I just want you to know the word responsible is actually kind of a combination of two words, response and able, right? Responsibility, your ability to respond. And I would suggest that your ability to respond to your environment is very much affected by how willing you are to be genuine, and also how willing you are to be sensitive. And that if you're dedicated to being an authentic, sensitive person, my guess is that you're also going to be seen as being fairly responsible also. There's a third element to the real self that's very important to understand. When you're genuine and sensitive, you're also vulnerable. And another way to think of this is a squishy. That because you're exposed, and because you have this kind of rawness to you where you're being sensitive and genuine and responsible, you're also vulnerable. So that when people hurt you, you really can feel it. It's very upsetting and to be genuine and sensitive at times. And so you can be really just very hurt when other people are inconsistent or unstable or whatever. And so that's another element of the real self that's important to understand. And that's a byproduct of the first two. It being genuine and sensitive not only leads to responsibility, but it also leads to this vulnerableness that we have to understand. Now, what begins to happen, and this is what James Masterson says, is what begins to happen is we begin to develop a shield of sorts around the real self. The real self, see, there is in the center, there's in the core. And as we are hurt, we have this natural desire to want to protect the real self and to stop it from being hurt. And so we begin to develop these protective strategies or layers that shield the real self from being hurt. And when you think about that marble example where I'm exchanging marbles with the student and then slap their hand, they immediately, because that's a raw, think about how raw that is. Here we have this good rhythm of exchange, and then suddenly you smack me, like, holy cow. Well, the next time we interact, of course I'm going to put up a little bit of a barrier because I don't want to be hurt. But of course, what begins to happen is that those protective strategies, they become ingrained and they become secondhand. And we begin to use them even when we're not at risk of being hurt. We begin to use them even as weapons. And so we construct the fake self or the counterfeit self, or I also like to call it the complete BS self. And you've probably known this about yourself or about others. You've seen this where you go, oh, right, I'm not really expressing my true emotions here, or I'm not really being sensitive to the other guy. I'm not willing to be vulnerable, I'm being irresponsible. And that as we do that, we really create this kind of hard candy shell around our soft, squishy chocolate center that really is the best part of us. And that gets to be a problem. Masterson talks about the 10 key capacities of the real self. And that if you're living a full, genuine, and sensitive life where you're willing to be vulnerable and responsible, then these are going to be some things that are characteristics of that real self, or capacities of that real self. The capacity to experience a wide range of feelings deeply, obviously, right? That's part of being genuine, is to experience those feelings genuinely and authentically. The capacity to expect appropriate entitlements, the capacity to self-activate and assert, acknowledgement of self-esteem, the ability to soothe painful feelings, just like that example over here of being out by oneself and being able to self-soothe. A person who really can be genuine and sensitive and responsible and vulnerable tends to have the capacity to also to self-soothe, which is an important element of the real self, according to Masterson. The ability to make and stick to commitments, that's part of that responsibility. Creativity. Intimacy, and this is a funny one. In our society, intimacy, we always associate that with sex, but of course that's not what intimacy means. The true definition of intimacy has a lot more to do with meaningful exchange between two parties. That intimacy is, another way to say it is interpersonal intimacy, where you feel a certain sense of closeness and understanding with another person. And so you need to understand that intimacy is something that the real self is able to express and receive. The ability to be alone, and then also continuity of self. The idea that what I did yesterday I'm not like off the hook for my behaviors in the past. I'm responsible for them. They're my heritage and they're me. And then also I'll continue to exist into the future. That what I do today will matter for tomorrow. And so the planning I do and the actions that I take today affect the future. Some people try to block either one of those or both. They try to say what I've done in the past doesn't matter right now, and you can't hold me responsible for it. Other people say, my life's so horrible right now, I don't have any future. And so don't try to tell me to brighten up or cheer up, because how I'm feeling right now is just how I'm going to have to feel. And then some people block both of those things. I'm neither responsible for the past nor responsible to my future, and I'm just existing in some kind of compartmentalized now that please don't try to make me responsible or genuine or sensitive or vulnerable, because I'm just right here. So continuity of self is an important thing to understand, and it's one of the important key capacities of the real self. And here's these 10 that Masterson suggests that we want to strive for, and that by striving for these things we can find our real self. Now, if we can have the real self and we can lose it, then what goes on when we're constructing the false self? As we begin to build these shells around ourselves, how does that happen? Well, it's very important to understand that all social organisms, or those case-selected organisms that we talked about before, survive by employing two key strategies that maximize their ability to survive. The first is to be accurate, or to be right. You can think about this as you're in the jungle and you see some berries, and they're purple berries, and of course you know that your Uncle Gus once died from eating purple berries, but you also know that there's some purple berries in the forest that if you eat, they're delicious and they're actually a really good food source. And so you really need to be right about which of these berries, these purple berries, are these the one kind that killed Uncle Gus, or are these the kind that you can eat? And being accurate about that is going to increase your ability to survive. Having accurate judgments is critical to our success to live. That if we're wrong about that, then we fall over and keel over and we die. Because we're social organisms and we rely so much on each other, another drive that we have is to look good to each other. And these two put together you could call the ego, right? Like this idea that we have to look good and we have to be right. And these desires are natural, they're adaptive, and they help us pass on our genes. But they're really problematic, and they run amok. And I want to show you that. This author, Catherine Schultz, she talks about, in this book she calls Being Wrong, she talks about this idea that of all the things that humans do and are and that defines us, being wrong is one of the things that we really got to get used to if we're going to be happy. That just by the nature of being alive, we are going to encounter wrongness. We're going to be wrong today. We're going to be wrong tomorrow. We've probably been wrong 100,000 times in the past. And that being wrong is really not only an adventure, but something that we really need to own and own correctly, because so many people try to hide from the fact that they've done wrong things. But the reality is we all do wrong things. Tattooed on every single person's forehead is I'm human, I make mistakes, those mistakes hurt other people, and that's okay. That there's this kind of reality of like, look, we're human, and yes, we do wrong things, we make mistakes, and those mistakes hurt people, but we can make that right. That doesn't have to be something that we hide from. But you'll see people walking around with kind of like a Band-Aid on their head, trying to hide the tattoo that says, I'm human, I make mistakes, those mistakes hurt other people, and also that's okay. They cover everything up with except that's okay, right? They just go around and look, hey, look, I'm okay. I don't make mistakes, and I don't hurt other people, and I'm not human, these kinds of things. And you can see how that can begin to construct the false self. But more than anything, it's not so much about being wrong that is the issue anyway, right? If you spill a glass of milk, the fact that it's happened is kind of water under the bridge. It's done. It's over with. When you spill a glass of milk, what really matters is not that it's spilled. What really matters is how you clean it up. And that's partly what Catherine Schultz's message is if we could master the art of being wrong, which is to say, if we could deal with it graciously and gracefully and really clean up after ourselves in a respectful, responsible, genuine, sensitive, vulnerable way, then of course we could be super successful at being human. But this innate drive in us to be accurate and look good really gives us a problem with being wrong. It's one of the most embarrassing things to be wrong in front of other people, because it's a simultaneous kind of insult to both being accurate and also looking good, right? And so that's a problem. Now, there's another author, Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck. She writes this book, Mindset, and she's looked at different kinds of learners, and she's found something very interesting, that the students that are able to learn best, that really succeed, especially in the face of challenges, are those who understand that it's okay to be wrong and that being wrong is part of learning. And she calls this mindset. And for the people that are okay with being wrong, she calls those people as having growth mindset. And the people who are not okay with being wrong, she calls that fixed mindset. And here's what she's discovered is that both of these types of learners encounter mistakes. But what happens, and when they encounter a mistake, both of their brains light up and goes, oh no, here's a mistake. But when a person with growth mindset, who's okay with the fact that sometimes they're going to be wrong as they learn, when a person with growth mindset encounters a mistake, their brain continues to fire. The mistake is just a cascade effect of brain activity, where they continue to think because they realize that they need to clean up the milk, so to speak. And they get to it. They start working at it because they have nothing to lose. They understand that being right is not the most important thing, and looking good is not the most important thing. They understand that learning to overcome the mistakes is what matters. In contrast, people with fixed mindset, what happens with them is when they encounter a mistake, their brain fires, but it fires just once, and then it shuts down. And what's happening with them is that they're so overwhelmed with the fact that they're not right and that they don't look good that they don't want to keep trying. And of course, if you don't keep trying, you can't learn. And so these people not only tend to struggle with the fact that mistakes are made and part of the learning process, but they tend to be the most resistant to learning episodes. And so it's another way of saying that, look, if you really want to be a good learner, You really have to be okay with being sometimes exposed to the vulnerabilities of being wrong. And that if you create a shell where being right and looking good becomes more important than learning and growing and taking care of the mistakes, then of course you're going to stagnate. Now, here I have the two lists. The first is what our body and our brain and our evolution, or in other words you could say the natural man, tells us to do. It tells us to be right and look good. Those are the priorities. And then we'll look over here. The priorities of the real self are be genuine, be sensitive, be vulnerable. And these priorities are what allow us to seek true happiness in relationships and actually truly survive. But it doesn't feel that way to our instinctive self. Be right and look good are some instincts that are social instincts, but they're not ultimately very healthy in wanting to seek true happiness. You want to eke out some kind of survival, be right and look good, and you can eke out a survival. If you want to be fulfilled in your life, be genuine, sensitive, and vulnerable. Now it's funny, you could also characterize this as pride, right? Be right, look good, that has to do with pride. Be genuine, sensitive, be vulnerable, that's anti-pride. It's the other way around. And it's funny, the other night I was on Facebook and I was scrolling through my newsfeed, and I was interesting how often this dichotomy of should we be right and look good or should we be genuine, sensitive, and vulnerable, how often it came up in the posts. And just in a 5-minute period, I was able to find 3 different posts that really speak to this. And it's partly because our society understands that this is going on, and they're trying to find ways to express it. Let me see if I have that. Here we go. Okay, so this one says, being constantly offended doesn't mean you're right. It just means you're too narcissistic to tolerate opinions different than yours. And that really speaks to this idea that people go around and they're so bent on being right that they're not going to be sensitive to the fact that other people, or vulnerable to the fact that other people have different opinions, right? And that's all about looking good, or having this pride. This next one says, when a woman veils her body in modesty, she is not hiding herself from men. She is revealing her dignity to them. And I think that speaks to this, right? This idea of how do we look good? Do we look good by exposing ourselves? Is that what it means to be genuine, is to run around naked? And I had a student once say that. They said, if we were truly being genuine, wouldn't we just all run around naked? Isn't clothing a way of masking the real self? And the answer is no, absolutely not. That's not genuine at all, because we have an understanding about the importance of dignity. And that's what this is expressing, is this idea that to be genuine and sensitive and vulnerable, you also have to protect yourself in key ways, or maintain your dignity. And this doesn't have anything to do with being right or looking good. It has to do with maintaining a sense of awareness or a sensitivity to the way that our bodies affect the lives of other people. You know, if we run around naked all the time, people are going to be looking at us and go, whoa, this kind of thing. And that's not a very sensitive way to act. It's also not very genuine or vulnerable. Okay? Here's another one. This is Bill. Bill has lots of opinions about different things. Bill knows that other people have their own opinions about things too. Bill doesn't think that everyone else is wrong just because their opinions aren't the same as his. Bill is smart. Be like Bill. And this is kind of a post on social media where all these people get on and try to be right and look good. That's most of social media is about those two things. If you're spending a lot of time posting on social media, you're probably concerned and feeding the idea to be right and look good. Whereas if you're being genuine, sensitive, and vulnerable, social media really loses its appeal pretty quickly. And that's what it's saying here. Bill doesn't get on and cross-comment on everyone else's stuff because he's sensitive and he can express himself genuinely and be vulnerable to other people without having to go and be right and look good, right? So those are some things that I wanted to draw out. Now, the next thing to understand, I skipped over a slide. I thought it was out of order here, but let me go back. So, constructing and maintaining a false self, I took James Masterson's words and I just flipped them on their head to write a list out of things that I thought would help a person construct and maintain the false self. So let's look at this. Repressing and numbing feelings to avoid expressing them honestly. And you can see how that's kind of putting a shell up. Expecting inappropriate entitlements too little or too much of something, right? Helplessness and self-sabotage, undermining self-esteem by focusing on other esteem, right? Self-esteem is what we think of ourselves. Other esteem is what other people think of us. Wallowing in or failing to address painful feelings, including people who scab pick, which is, in other words, if something's trying to heal, they just won't let it heal. They keep bringing it up and dredging it up. Refusing to make commitments, making false commitments, or giving up. Maintaining rigid, traditional, or popular strategies, even when effective. Avoiding or devaluing the importance of interpersonal intimacy. Refusal to be alone or inability to separate loneliness from being alone. Failing to acknowledge the past or have hope for the future. Okay, so those are some things that can help you maintain the false self. Now, as we look at this false self, remember the real self is in there, and the real self actually is what wants to be loved. It wants to show love, and when you deal with a dyad using a false self, what happens is the genuine expressions of love that are shown to you by other people really bounce off your shell, because you can't feel them because your real self is hidden. And so it's very, very upsetting for people who have a false self to be in a relationship where another person is expressing true love or really sensitive expressions to them, genuine expressions to them, because they can't really feel them. Their sensitive part's hidden, and so it kind of bounces off of them. They don't know how to take it. Simultaneously, they're not only unable to be sensitive to other people's genuineness, but they're unable to be genuine. And so because the real self's in there, they can't really express themselves genuinely. And it's sad because they want to be loved, but it's like they're stuck in the doldrums where there's no wind and there's no wind in their sails. And of course, because they can't get any wind in their sails, they can't get over to where the wind is. And because they can't get over to the wind and where the wind is, then there's no wind in their sails. And so it's this catch-22 of wanting to be loved and wanting to show love, but being so afraid of being hurt that you're not willing to be exposed, right? That's the whole point here. Is it's more important for me to protect myself than it is for me to show true expression of love to someone else. It's more important for me to protect myself than to receive true affection from another person. And so their kind of shell, it really harms them because they want to be loved, but their fake self prevents them from experiencing it. And it can feel very trapping. And what do I do? How do I get out of this, right? Now, in terms of the wishing thing that we talked about earlier, this is super important to understand. Part of when we wish, we're talking about what we're entitled to or what we hope to receive, right? And I want to bring this up as a side note because I think it's important to understand something about those wishes that we have as we look at those wishes. Here we have an example of Simba and Scar, and they're important because they both want the same thing. They both want to be king. Simba is actually entitled to be king. And so is Scar. Scar is next in line for the throne, but he would have to wait until Simba legitimately passed away. And of course, Scar doesn't think that's going to happen. So he's going to take matters into his own hands and try to wipe out Simba. And of course, he's a murderer. He killed his brother. So he's really just in a bad way. He's a really good example of the false self. He's not being genuine and sensitive and vulnerable. Instead, he's constructed this shell, and he's really just wiping other people out. He's weaponized his shell, and he's just wiping other people out. Okay? Now, a key element of seeking our desires is involving other people. Here, Simba wants to be king, and in order to achieve that, you'll notice that he has some companions that are really interested in helping him because they care about him, because he is not constructed a false self. So as he expresses himself, they're able to see that, and they're able to express themselves back to him and see, oh, you really need to go back and confront your past and these kinds of things so that you can be happy. And they support him in that freely. Scar involves other people also. He involves the hyenas, but he involves them through coercion, through manipulation, through lying, through empty promises, through false senses of abundance, and also really a lot of hard work. the hyenas get roped into it thinking, well, we're not going to have to work that hard for our food if Scar is king. But they actually end up working harder for their food than when Mufasa was king. The reason why this is important is because the way you get what you want in life is by involving other people. And if you have a hard candy shell that blocks your real self, you're going to try to do all kinds of things of involving other people in reaching your goals in ways that aren't effective. But if you're real and soft and genuine and vulnerable and sensitive, then people are going to step in and naturally want to help you because they also see that helping you, they're going to be helping. There's going to be that circle of exchange between you and them. Whereas Scar's interactions are way more characteristic of that dyad where the false self is interacting with the real self. Now, another, just as a side note, as we're talking about the wishes, there are some wishes that are inappropriate. And I call this is the Ariel test. Oh, this is the Simba test. Look at your list of wishes and say, how willing am I to appropriately involve other people in achieving these wishes? Remember, being social creatures, we have to have other people in our lives to be happy. Am I involving other people in the way that Simba involved other people? Or am I involving other people in the way that Scar involved other people? Now, while we're talking about seeking wishes, Ariel's wish was unique because she wanted legs. She was a mermaid and she wanted legs. And in order to get the legs, she had to go and make a deal, and then there was magic involved. And here's a little tip about making wishes. If what you wish for requires magic in order to achieve it, it's not an appropriate wish. The Little Mermaid was based on a Danish fairy tale called Rusalka. And Rusalka actually encounters something very different than what happens in Disney's version. In Rusalka's tale, she wants legs and she makes a deal and gets them through magic. And then it turns out the guy that she's after runs away with some other girl. And because she doesn't get that love, then she's cursed, you see. And she becomes a mermaid of death, or an angel of death in the water. And has to live out the rest of her life killing people because the bargain that she made fell through. She didn't get her love. And of course what happens in the end is that she ultimately has to kill this guy that she loves with a kiss of death. And when it's her turn to die. And so she lives out the rest of her days in sadness. Here's her statue, I think in Denmark. And it's a cautionary tale. The fairy tale was originally constructed to be a warning fairy tale. The moral is, don't wish for things that require magic to achieve. Otherwise, you're going to end up like Rusalka. Don't do that. If you're a mermaid, figure out a way to be happy with your mermaid tail. Don't go around looking for someone with magic to give you legs. You're not going to be happy. I promise. And so it's funny how Disney takes things and really makes them with rainbows and unicorns when actually that's a super helpful tale to understand. Is look, don't wish for things that aren't appropriate. So now, earlier I had you write out your wishes, and we've talked a little bit about the real self. We talked about involving other people, and have a talk with yourself. If you need to pause the video, now is a good time to pause the video and take a little break from me yapping at you. But answer these questions. What is it that I really wish for and want in life? Are my wishes realistic? Do I have an appropriate sense of entitlement about my wishes? Do I look to involve others in achieving my dreams? And what are the primary ways that I enlist others to help me? Now, I want to talk a little bit about Beast and why being genuine and sensitive is so important. You'll notice that Beast is a really good example of the false self. The real Prince Adam is in there. He's hiding. And Beast is this shell that he's constructed. And it became constructed through pride, through treating another person without genuine sensitivity and vulnerability. And so he's cursed to live this kind of false self. And it's really terrible. And this speaks, I think, to the importance of having positive relationships in our life and the importance of involving other people as we seek our goals. And I just want to talk about relationships for a minute here and what they mean to us. Friedman said, there is no simple recipe for producing happiness. but all of the research indicates that for almost everyone, one necessary ingredient is some kind of satisfying intimate relationship. And Erich Fromm said something similar. This desire for interpersonal union is the most powerful striving in mankind. It is the most fundamental passion. It is the force which keeps the human race together. Without love, humanity could not exist for a day. And you can see that Beast in his solitude is really lacking that interpersonal happiness that would otherwise break the spell and allow him to live a full life. Now, it's also important to note that because people are so important to us, they also cause a lot of problems for us. When asked the most depressing thing that has happened to you in the past year, 7 out of 8 people will tell you that it was something interpersonal. That the most depressing thing that happened to them in the past year involves someone else that hurt them, right? Another thing, if you ask people the last bad thing that happened to you, 50% of the time people will tell you a story that involves another person hurting them. So it's important to understand that it's not at all about whether or not conflict occurs, because it will. By and large, if you're dealing with people, people are some of the most inconsistent people. Well, yeah, they're people. Inconsistent things that you can deal with because they're people. So it comes down to this idea that it's not so much about whether or not the conflict will happen, because it will. People will hurt you. Remember, tattooed on everyone's forehead is this idea that I'm human, I make mistakes, my mistakes hurt other people, including you, and that's okay. Because it's not whether or not the conflict occurs, but how you choose to manage the conflict that matters. And usually the best solutions involve mutually sought equitable resolutions. So, as we talk about the real self, and we talk about what allows us to be happy, the biggest barrier to intimacy is really an unwillingness to deal with conflict or unwillingness to deal with hurt that other people cause us. We say, look, I am so sick of being hurt by other people that I'm going to put up a wall, and in putting up a wall, I'm going to isolate myself and make it so that I can't experience that intimate interaction between my real self and the other real self. It's important to note, and I hope you picked up on this, but the word genuine really speaks to something that you're putting out. That genuineness is about how you present yourself. And that sensitivity is really about how you experience other people. That being sensitive has to do with bringing in. Genuine is what you put out, sensitive is what you experience and bring in. Now, interpersonal intimacy is just exactly like that exchange where you have this other person who's putting out something that you're taking in, and you're taking in something they're putting out, and you're putting out something they're taking it in. And that's that kind of exchange of the marbles between the two hands. That rhythm of exchange is really very important, where you say, look, I'm feeling this way, and they say, I'm feeling this way, and you say, okay, and okay, and that's super important. But when you build up that false self, it's very difficult to have this kind of interaction that's rewarding. And that's exactly what happens with Beast, because he's not willing to be genuine or sensitive. All of his interpersonal interactions are clouded by this shell. And so that's what Beast's tale is really about, is that this idea that his shell is really getting in the way of his ability to be responsible and vulnerable and have happiness. Now, I want us to watch this clip of Beast transforming from the Beast back into his real self, because I think it's very powerful, and it speaks to the importance of being genuine and sensitive. He, for the first time in their interactions, is about to express a genuine expression of love. He says to Belle in the scene, he says, at least I got to see you one last time. And that's just as good. You can hear this in the undertones of what he's saying. It's just as good as if he were to have said, I love you. And it's maybe one of the first times in the film where he has totally let his guard down. And he's not trying to be a fake self anymore. He's not trying to be abrasive. He's just trying to express his true self without any kinds of strings attached. And then Belle responds, and she says, I love you. And it's the first complete cycle for Beast. It's important because it's that first complete cycle of a genuine expression of how he's feeling. At least I got to see you one last time. And a sensitive response to Belle saying, I love you, right? And so then that's what ultimately breaks the spell. So let's watch this clip and see kind of this transformation from the fake self back into the real self.
this is all my fault. If only I'd gotten here sooner.
Maybe it's better. It's better this way.
Don't talk like that. You'll be all right. We're together now. Everything's going to be fine. You'll see.
At least I got to see you one last time.
No. Please. Please. Please don't leave me. I love you. It is you.
Now, I don't know how many of you who have ever had kisses that produce fireworks, but if you've ever had that, you'll know and understand that it comes from the expression of the real self and this genuine, sensitive vulnerability, responsibility. And that's really a key to happiness. Now, throughout all of this, what I hope the message that you can take away from this is that you really ought to pursue the wishes that you have and follow your dreams, but that it's critical for our happiness to involve others along the way, involves others along the way. And it's critical because really what we want in life is to have positive, healthy, genuine, sensitive, vulnerable interactions with other people. And that as often as we hide from that or mask ourselves and make it so that we can't have those things, it really makes our dreams one of two things, either impossible to achieve or meaningless. Because a lot of times, what is a dream if you can't involve other people and share it with them as well? So I hope that this has been useful. I hope this has been helpful to you. And I really, if you have questions, you can certainly email me and ask, or if you have comments. I always like to hear people's thoughts about this presentation. And so if you have parting comments, just let me know. But really, I want you to think about the importance of being your real self, and also hoping that those around you are able to be their real selves, and then also choosing to involve them in your dreams in healthy and positive ways.